I want you to notice one of the lessons about rebel. Rebel man, it's so pointed for you to learn. I want to read this passage. It's in Jeremiah chapter 21 in verse 8. Here's what it says. The Lord speaks to him and says, now you shall say to the people, thus says the Lord, behold, I set before you the way of life and the way of death. He who remains in this city shall die by the sword, by famine, and by pestilence. But he who goes out and defects to the Chaldeans who besiege you, he shall live, and his life shall be as a prize to him. There's hope. There's hope. Every rebel, even for rebel man, there's hope. For either one of rebel men up here, there's hope. You know what the hope is? Surrender. If you surrender, then I'll extend my grace to you and you won't die. If you'll admit that you're wrong, if you'll accept your consequence, if you'll choose to surrender, then everything will be okay. But let me tell you this while we're here. If you choose not to surrender, I'll put you in a position where you are forced to surrender and you'll have no choice in the matter. Now, there's a process involved. 9 years, Zedekiah, rebel man, was large and in charge. 9 years. Then for 2 years, rebel man, Zedekiah, was shriveled up and struggling and having a hard time and fighting to make it through. But he never was willing to surrender. There's a process engaged in this. Listen to me. If you choose to surrender, you'll waste a whole lot less time. If you choose to surrender, you'll bear a whole lot less consequences. If you choose to surrender, you'll have a whole lot less hurt in your life. You'll destroy a whole lot fewer people in your life. But if you go on in your arrogance and you continue in your rebellion, then what's going to happen is the cost is going to be great. God's going to force you to surrender, but it'll be troublesome. It'll be difficult. It'll take a long time. The pain will be devastating, and the lessons will cut you to the very core of your being. If you choose to surrender, then what happens is God will show up and grant you life. Let me tell you what happens. It's the word of Jeremiah. The people respond. It's in 2 Kings 25. His army, Zedekiah's army, rebel man's army, they break a section of the wall out. Zedekiah wouldn't let them go out the gate. Well, that's fine. They broke a section of the wall out, and they went out the wall. His entire army leaves him sitting in the city. I told you it's a comical story. They all run 18 miles south to Jericho. Well, what Zedekiah does, he gets in on the tail of the exit. He sees the army leaving. He says, I'm not staying here by myself. That's another thing that happens. When rebel men, they're big, strong, robust guys as long as everything's going their way, but when the consequences start hitting, they melt real quick. Zedekiah says, I'm leaving, and out the door he goes. They go down to Jericho, and when they get to Jericho, rebel man has to face who he is. Rebel man has to face it. In fact, let me tell you what happens. He was forced to surrender. Because of being forced to surrender, rebel man is gone. For 11 years, he's been rebel man. Down by the Jordan River, just outside Jericho, Nebuchadnezzar took Zedekiah, fixed his hands and feet in bronze stocks, fetters. With these bronze fetters attached to him, he sat him down where he could not move and forced him to look as one by one Zedekiah's children were brought out one by one, and one by one they were slaughtered. Their throats were cut right in front of Zedekiah. Rebel man. Every child dies right in front of him. After the death of every child, Nebuchadnezzar came to Zedekiah and they plucked his eyes out. The last sight Zedekiah had while he lived. The very last sight. The thing he remembered was his children's throats being cut right in front of him. He was taken to Babylon in bronze fetters, mocked and jeered, forced into humility and surrender. Butchered before him were his children. See, that's what rebel man leads you to. It's a sobering story. The lesson here is so clear, I don't want you to miss it. The lesson is this: rebellion will isolate you from everybody around you. Even your closest servants, even those who love you the most, will abandon you eventually. Rebellion will isolate you all alone. But let me note this: it will not insulate you from the consequences. Sooner or later, you may think, I'm a category of one, I'm unstoppable, but you won't be. Sooner or later, that financial mess you've created, it'll come crashing down. Sooner or later, those family issues you've developed, they'll come crashing down. Sooner or later, the garbage that the people around you are having to deal with, sooner or later, it's going to catch you. Sooner or later, the problems are going to overtake you. Sooner or later, you're going to come to your Jericho. The consequences are going to be undeniable. You know what's really sad is it creates difficulty and it creates death for everybody around you. While you're in rebel mode, you think, I can outrun it. I can manage the outcomes. I can insulate myself from all this junk that's going to happen. I'm unique. There's nobody ever been like me. But suddenly your life will come to a place where your army leaves and your life is spinning out of control. And when it starts spinning out of control, it won't be long until the consequences come upon you. If you don't choose surrender, God will eventually force you into surrender. He'll send you Jeremiahs all the way along. It may be a preacher. It may be a Sunday school teacher. It may be a song or a CD or a book. It may be a Christian author. It may be a radio. Somehow, somewhere, God will reach to you in grace, but it's the last thing you want to hear. And so you deny it, and you ignore it, and you turn away from it. And what happens is you wind up in tragedy because you want to be large and in charge.